Hello everybody, this is Gregory with 5 Minute Catholic Apologetics and Living, where 5 minutes of your time may get you to the divine. Today we're going to talk about how a little nip and tuck in your church interior architecture can make a world of difference. Now before we begin, let's start with a prayer. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritui Sancti. Amen. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto, sequitur in principio et nunc et semper et in saecula saeculorum. Amen. So I have a friend of mine who went back to his hometown of Sweeney, Texas, small town Texas, for you guys who are not living in Texas. And he went to go visit his parish, and his hometown parish had a different look back in the day, back in the spirit of Vatican II days. And look, my parish in Houston, Texas, St. Thomas More, man, talk about modernist. So they built that original parish in the 60s, and it was basilica architecture. Then they rebuilt it in the early 70s, and it had this strange stained glass on all four sides. It was a very modern looking church and had the four seasons, because man of four seasons, Thomas More. But very abstract, weird art, and just very modern. And it still has that form, because sadly, when you build a church, it's hard to change the exterior architecture without spending a lot of money. But the interior can change. And even when you change the interior, or let's say you have a very modernist outside, but the interior is a little more traditional, there is this dissonance. There's a dissonance to it. There was a church in San Antonio, because I live not far from San Antonio, St. Pius X, that had the traditional Latin Mass for a long time. And when you would walk in there, the architecture was very modern. And then you would have the TLM, and they would do it ad Orientem and whatnot. But it was just very strange, right? Because you would think there'd be like a consistency, a uniformity, a harmony, because that was the intentional creation of churches, that everything would be aligned. But either way, so my friend sent me a picture of what the church used to look like, and he said that prior to this, it was even more Spirit of Vatican II, for lack of a better word. And we have an ongoing playlist here called Liturgical Abuses That Drive Me Crazy, and I've done maybe 12 of these, and one of them I did from the cathedral in Chicago, because the cathedral in Chicago is crazy. That's Cardinal Supich's church, and it's just very modern. But I talk about it in the famous book that was written about 20 years ago, Ugly as Sin, by Michael Rose. He talks about how after Vatican II, a lot of dioceses hired Protestant architects to design their churches to make them look more utilitarian, more like a meeting hall, less sacred, because they thought this would be less alienating to Protestants. And what are we seeing? In this gesture, similar to Annabella Sonini creating the Novus Ordo Mass as an attempt to false ecumenism to bring Protestants back, because we think if we water our things down and make it more like the Protestants will come back. Well, clearly that doesn't work. Anyone could have told you that wouldn't work. But you do see now this current where churches that had a very modern architecture in the interior are changing. And you also see priests that are trying to change it. So if you look at the churches that have the more modernist look, and look, the before picture here is not even that bad compared to churches that don't even have the tabernacle. And I think the church before this renovation 50 years ago didn't have the tabernacle. But even this one, you can see there's a statue of Mary, there's a statue of Joseph, there's a tabernacle and whatnot. Yes, it's got kind of like modernist looks, but at least compared to a lot of churches, it isn't that bad. And we talked about in that episode, what can priests, pastors learn from the TLM and the ordinariate churches? Because when you go to the TLM and you go to the ordinariate, these are churches that have traditional architecture as a whole, especially the TLMs that are designed for TLM, like the Society of St. Peter. And the ordinariate is very Anglican, very traditional looking, ad Orientem. What do you notice? At these churches, there's big congregations, big families, solemnity, large growing parishes. And when you notice in the more modernist churches, the ones that still have, the for lack of a better word, let's say it, not sacred and crappy interior architecture, no statues, very limited stained glass, the circle approach where we're all looking at each other, all these things. The average age is probably 74, not a lot of young families. And so what can pastors of these parishes that don't have hubris learn? Well, maybe lex oriendi, lex credendi, lex vivendi. Maybe if we change the architecture, it'll make a difference. And it does. So you look at this church in Sweeney. Here's a picture of what it looks like now. They put in little retablo, in other words, a little high altar behind it. They have the guardian angels. They have the candles. Much more of the traditional pre-1970 Novus Ordo architecture. And it just kind of reminds you like what you can do, even with limited space and maybe limited funds. You can make a church look more solemn and more traditional, more vertical in its approach. You can do that. It's just, where there's a will, there's a way. And certainly if money is an issue, depending on the parish, depending on the location, some parishioners will be like, yeah, let's do a capital campaign, let's renovate. And other times they won't. I'm not going to name names, but where I live, not far from where I live, there's a very large parish where the pastor wants to create a high altar behind the church, and he's getting resistance. And I don't get it, because high altars, retablos, have been around in church architecture going back to the Romanesque period, 1,000 years. It is quite common. You'll find them in Baroque, Neo-Gothic, all the way up into the 1950s. It was very common to have an high altar that would encase the tabernacle and normally would have statues and candles and whatnot. And he's getting resistance, and it drives me crazy. I don't understand why you'd want that. And if I had to guess, these aren't like young, tattoo, pierced-laden 25-year-old radical leftists. These are the 75-year-olds who are upset that the Spirit of Vatican II didn't complete its job. And part of that job was to, I'm not going to generalize these people, but bring in female diaconate, bring in female priests, bring in divorce and remarriage, bring in all these things that we see in the Catholic culture war. But in closing, look, churches can do this. They can change the architecture, and people will come, like Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. Catholics of my generation and younger generations have seen and been to so many bad masses that everyone's craving for something traditional, something in solemn. And if the majority of these Our Lady of Suburbia parishes would go back and just spend some money to renovate and make it, do the best they can, at the least bring the tabernacle back and put a corpus behind it, at the least do these things, you will see a change in the amount of people going. You will see it. And if you throw in like the cherry on top, change the music, you will definitely see a change. Guys, post in the comments, what is your parish like? Have they done any renovations? I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, take care. God bless.